No one prepares you for the moment a lioness walks out of the dark and into human light. She doesn't charge. She doesn't retreat. She doesn't roar. In her jaws is a white cub, too weak to stand, too small to survive on its own. In that moment, everything we thought we understood about the wild stops making sense. Because she isn't there to hunt. She isn't there by accident. She's there to hand something over. And the reason she carried her cub to the station was not something any of us were ready to face. The night shift at Red Basin Wildlife Outpost was usually defined by absence. No traffic. No radio chatter beyond weather checks. Just the hum of the floodlights and the dry wind dragging across scrub and rock. Ethan Walker liked it that way. Quiet made patterns easier to notice. Quiet kept mistakes small. He was halfway through a routine perimeter log when the motion sensor tripped. Not fast. Not erratic. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Ethan looked up at the monitor, expecting a stray mule deer or a drifting shadow from the wind-blown brush. Instead, a large shape entered the outer edge of the camera frame, muscular, unmistakable. A lioness stepped forward, her coat dusted with pale grit, her shoulders rolling with each controlled movement. In her jaws, something white swung gently, almost weightless. For a split second, Ethan couldn't process what he was seeing. Then, the shape resolved. A cub. White. Dot. Not pale gold. Not sun-bleached. White, in a way that caught the floodlights and threw it back like cloth. The cub hung limp, its legs tucked inward, its small head rocking with each step as the lioness crossed into the open. Ethan's hand froze over the radio. The lioness advanced until she reached the hard line where gravel met concrete, the invisible boundary the animals almost never crossed. She stopped there. No growl. No charge. She lowered her head and set the cub down carefully, adjusting it with a brief nudge of her muzzle so it lay on its side, facing the light. Then she stepped back. Ethan exhaled without realizing he'd been holding his breath. His training screamed at him to retreat, to shut the inner door, to call it in and wait. A lioness that close to the station was not a situation to interpret. It was a situation to survive. Yet, nothing about her posture matched the threat his instincts expected. Her ears were forward, not pinned. Her tail hung low, motionless. She wasn't watching Ethan. She was watching the cub. The cub's chest rose and fell, shallow and uneven. One paw twitched, then still. Its eyes remained closed. Ethan slowly reached for the radio and keyed the mic, keeping his movements smooth, unhurried. "Outpost to base," he said quietly. "I've got a lioness at the perimeter. She's carrying a cub. White. Dot. Repeat. She brought it here." The response crackled back, disbelief thinly masked by protocol. Ethan didn't argue. He kept his eyes on the yard. The lioness shifted her weight and took one step forward, then stopped again as if testing an invisible limit. She lowered her head and released a low sound. Not a roar, not a warning. It vibrated through the ground more than the air. A sound meant to be felt. Ethan swallowed. He'd heard that tone once before, years ago, when a cow elk refused to leave her injured calf during a wildfire evacuation. The sound wasn't aggression. It was insistence. The wind pushed through the open yard, carrying the dry scent of dust and something sharper beneath it. The cub stirred, drawing a thin breath that caught halfway and ended in a faint rasp. The lioness lifted her head at once, muscles tightening, eyes fixed on the small body at her feet. She did not pick it up again. She did not flee. She stayed. Ethan realized, with a slow, unsettling clarity, that this animal had not wandered here by chance. She had chosen this place, chosen the lights, chosen the boundary. Whatever had driven her out of the dark and into the open had outweighed her fear of everything this station represented. He took a step closer to the inner door, careful not to let it scrape or echo. His heart hammered, not with panic, but with the weight of something unspoken, settling into the space between them. Outside, under the lights, the lioness lifted her gaze from the cub and met his eyes for the first time. She did not bare her teeth. She did not retreat. She waited. And in that moment, Ethan understood that the night was no longer routine, and whatever came next would not be covered by any manual he had ever been given. Ethan didn't move for several seconds after the lioness met his gaze. He let the moment stretch, counting his breaths the way he'd been taught, slow enough to keep his hands steady, quiet enough not to provoke a response. Outside, the cub shifted again, its small body drawing another shallow breath that seemed to cost it more effort than it should have. He keyed the radio a second time. "I need eyes and authority," he said. "This isn't a drive-off. She's not posturing." The reply came back with the clipped tone of someone buying time. Help was on the way, but not quickly. Red Basin sat too far from anything that moved fast after dark. Ethan slid the inner door closed until it met the latch, leaving the outer glass unobstructed. He wanted the lioness to see him, but not reach him. He kept his body angled, shoulders loose, hands visible at his sides. Every instinct he had told him not to stare, not to challenge, not to rush. Behind him, footsteps approached at a jog. Laura Chin emerged from the side hall, hair pulled back, jacket half-zipped, eyes already scanning the yard before Ethan said a word. "Oh," she said softly. Not fear. Recognition. "She brought it," Ethan said. "Set it down herself." Laura stepped beside him, stopping well short of the glass. She watched the lioness, the way a surgeon studies a monitor, taking in posture, breathing, distance. "She's not guarding," Laura said after a moment. "If she were, we'd know." The cub let out a thin sound that barely reached the room. Laura's jaw tightened. "How long has it been like that?" "Since she arrived." Another voice cut in from the rear, Mark Rivera, pulling on gloves as he moved. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, then caught himself and lowered his voice. He leaned toward the window, then stopped short when he saw the animal outside. "That's too close." "I know," Ethan said. Mark looked from the cub to the lioness, then back to Ethan. "You open that door and she decides you're the problem. There's no second chance." Laura didn't argue. She didn't need to. The rule book was clear. No approach. No interference. The station existed to observe and report, not to insert itself into a predator's choices. But the cub coughed again, a wet, uneven sound that ended in a tremor. The lioness lowered her head instantly, touching the cub's flank with her nose, then lifted her eyes toward the building. She took one step forward. Mark swore under his breath. "She's advancing." "She's testing," Laura said. "Or asking." Ethan felt the words settle uncomfortably in his chest. Asking implied intention. Intention implied responsibility. He checked the yard without turning his head, scanning the shadows beyond the lights. That was when he saw it. Movement along the far ridge, low and purposeful. Then another shape. And another. "Mark," he said quietly. "Get the scope." Mark raised the optics, adjusted, then went still. "We've got males," he said. "At least 2. Maybe more. West side." Laura closed her eyes for half a second. "If they're moving in, that changes the math." It did more than that. It reframed everything. A cub in distress drew attention. A white cub drew it faster. If the lioness had been pushed from her pride, or if the cub didn't belong, the approaching males would not hesitate. Outside, the lioness circled the cub once, restless now, her tail lifting slightly before dropping again. She glanced toward the darkness where the shapes had moved, then back to the station. Ethan felt the pressure building, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy. Every option carried weight. Do nothing, and the cub likely wouldn't last the night. Intervene, and they could trigger an attack they couldn't contain. Laura spoke without looking at him. "If she wanted to hurt us, she would have done it already." Mark shook his head. "That's not a guarantee." "No," Laura said. "But it's a data point." The cub's breathing hitched again. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Ethan realized his hands were clenched, nails digging into his palms. He looked at the lioness once more. She had stopped moving. She stood square to the lights, body tense but controlled. Eyes fixed not on the people inside, but on the space between them and the cub. The line. Ethan understood then that the danger wasn't only what might happen if they crossed it. It was what would happen if they didn't. He reached for the latch, stopping short of opening it. "We don't rush," he said, more to himself than to them. "We don't provoke. But we don't pretend this is nothing." Laura nodded. Mark didn't argue, but his jaw tightened. Outside, the lioness let out another low sound, deeper this time, vibrating through the concrete. She stepped closer to the boundary again and stopped, exactly where she had before. Not closer, not farther. Waiting. Wait. The shapes on the ridge did not rush the lights. They didn't need to. Ethan watched them through the glass as Mark adjusted the scope again, careful not to scrape it against the frame. The figures moved in and out of view, dark bodies threading through scrub and stone with practiced ease. They weren't hunting yet. They were positioning, cutting off angles, testing wind. "They know she's here," Mark said quietly, "and they know something's wrong." Laura leaned in, studying the pattern of movement. "They're not charging," she said. "That tells me this isn't about us. Not yet." Outside, the lioness felt it too. She lifted her head, ears rotating toward the ridge, body tightening as if a wire had been drawn through her spine. For the first time since she'd arrived, she paced, one slow arc around the cub, then another, placing herself between the small white body and the direction of the movement. Ethan noticed what she didn't do. She didn't pick the cub up. If flight had been an option, she would have taken it already. "She's boxed in," Laura said, "or choosing not to run." Mark lowered the scope. "Or she's setting bait." Laura shot him a look. "You don't bring your own cub into the open to set bait." Mark didn't respond, but his eyes stayed on the yard. The tension in the room thickened, pressing down on every sound. The cub stirred again, letting out a thin, broken whimper that faded almost as soon as it began. The lioness dropped her head immediately, touching the cub's side with her nose, then straightened. She took a step toward the station. Ethan felt the shift before he fully registered it. The air seemed to lean forward with her. She stopped just shy of the lion she had respected all night, claws digging slightly into the gravel as if to anchor herself. "She's closing distance," Mark said. "She's asking us to," Laura replied. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. He had seen animals charge fences, break glass, throw themselves against boundaries in panic or rage. This was neither. This was measured, intentional. The lioness was not trying to force entry. She was narrowing the choice. A low sound rolled out of her chest, deeper than before, carrying across the yard and into the building. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, like something meant to be felt in the bones. Ethan had the sudden, uncomfortable sense that this sound was not meant for him at all. It was meant for the dark. The response came a moment later, a distant rumble from the ridge, answered by another. The shapes there shifted, closing ranks, spreading just enough to suggest they were ready to move if given a reason. "If they come in," Mark said, "this becomes chaos." Ethan nodded. He already knew. A confrontation that close to the station would be uncontrolled, dangerous for everyone. And the cub, caught between forces it couldn't survive. Laura's voice dropped. "If she's been pushed out," she said, "or if that cub isn't accepted, she's running out of options. White cubs don't blend. They don't hide well, and they draw attention." Ethan looked down at the small body outside, its pale fur stark against the ground. It wasn't just vulnerable. It was conspicuous. A liability in a landscape that punished weakness quickly. The lioness moved again, this time angling her body so she stood squarely between the cub and the ridge. She glanced once toward the darkness, then turned her head and looked straight into the building. Not at the glass. At Ethan. There was no softness in her eyes, no plea that could be romanticized. There was urgency, calculation, a clear understanding that time was narrowing. She knows they're coming, Laura said, and she knows she can't win that fight and protect it. Mark exhaled sharply. So she brings it here, to us. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle fully now. This was no longer a question of whether they were allowed to intervene. The situation had moved beyond rules and into consequence. Outside, the lioness took another step closer to the boundary, closer than she had dared before. She stopped, head high, muscles coiled, daring something, or someone to make the next move. The cub's breathing faltered again, a thin catch that didn't fully release. Ethan's hand hovered near the latch without touching it. He understood then that the line between the station and the wild had already been crossed. The only question left was by whom. Ethan rested his hand against the door without opening it. He needed to feel where the barrier actually was. Not the glass, not the metal, but the moment itself. Once crossed, there would be no clean way back. Outside, the lioness held her ground. Her body remained angled toward the ridge, but her eyes stayed on the station, flicking once to the cub and back again. She was tracking two threats at once. Ethan recognized the posture. He'd seen it in wolves pinned between fire and fencing, in cattle guarding calves during flash flood. It wasn't aggression. It was triage. "We don't have long," Laura said. Her voice was steady, but her fingers had gone white around the clipboard. "If those males decide to test her, it'll happen fast." Mark shifted his weight. "If we open that door and she misreads it, we lose control of the yard." Ethan nodded. "I know." He ran through the options again, knowing none of them were good. Call for backup and wait, too slow. Fire a deterrent. Might scatter the males, might trigger the lioness. Tranquilize her. Risky at this distance, dangerous with the cub exposed. Do nothing, and watch the cub fail. Ethan looked at the cub's chest as it rose and fell, uneven and shallow. He noticed something he hadn't before. The way each breath seemed to pull the fur inward at the chest, as if something beneath the skin resisted the expansion. It was subtle. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. "Shield," he said suddenly. Mark looked at him. "What?" "The low canvas," Ethan said. "The one we use for injured ungulates. Angle it. Keep the cub in view. Bought. Give her a barrier that doesn't look like a wall." Laura's eyes narrowed, understanding clicking into place. "You want to change the picture without changing the threat." Ethan nodded once. "I want to give her something new to read." Mark hesitated, then moved. He unfolded the canvas slowly, keeping it low, careful not to let it snap or catch the light too sharply. Ethan cracked the door just enough to slide it through, then closed it again, heart pounding as the latch clicked back into place. Outside, the lioness stiffened. Her ears rotated forward, eyes locking onto the movement. For a fraction of a second, Ethan thought she might charge. She didn't. Instead, she shifted her weight and took a step back, reassessing. The canvas settled into place between the cub and the door, angled like a shallow wall. Not blocking, not advancing, simply present. Ethan opened the door again, this time wider. The night air rushed in, carrying dust, heat, and the raw scent of animal and earth. He stepped out slowly, keeping his body half turned, eyes soft, hands empty. Every nerve in his body screamed awareness. The lioness watched him closely, muscles taut, ready. But she did not move toward him. She did not move toward the cub. She waited. Ethan advanced one step at a time, stopping when the lioness shifted, continuing only when she stilled again. The distance closed painfully slowly. Cub lay just beyond the canvas now, its breathing shallow, eyes fluttering but unfocused. From the ridge, a low rumble echoed again, closer this time. The sound vibrated through the ground, carried on the wind. The lioness glanced back, then forward, torn between direction. "I'm not taking it yet," Ethan said quietly. Not to her, but to the moment. "I just need to see." He crouched, keeping his movements small. From this angle, the detail he'd noticed earlier sharpened into something undeniable. Beneath the white fur, a thin, dark line pressed into the cub's chest, disappearing under its forelimb. Not a wound, not teeth marks. Something wrapped. Ethan felt a chill run through him. The lioness took a single step backward, creating space. Not retreating, yielding. That was the moment everything locked into place. She wasn't guarding the cub from them. She was guarding them from the choice she had already made. Ethan extended one hand toward the cub, stopping short of contact. The lioness's eyes flicked to his fingers, then back to his face. Her body remained coiled, but her tail dropped lower, brushing the ground once. Permission, not given lightly, not without cost, but given. Behind him, Ethan heard the soft click of the door as Laura eased it open further, ready. Mark stood just inside, tense, scanning the ridge. Ethan drew a breath and shifted his weight forward, committing his balance to the move. There would be no pause after this. No reset. As his fingers closed around the air just above the cub's fur, the lioness released a low sound. Deeper than before. Steady, final. Ethan understood it not as warning, but as acknowledgement. Whatever happened next, there would be no pretending this night belonged only to the wild. Ethan did not lift the cub right away. He kept his hands close, hovering just above the white fur, letting the lioness see every inch of intent before it became action. Cub's body was warm. Too warm in some places, oddly cool in others, and the shallow rise of its chest stuttered as if each breath had to be negotiated. The lioness watched without blinking. Ethan slid one hand beneath the cub's chest and the other under its hindquarters, careful to support the spine. The moment contact was made, the cub let out a faint sound, more air than voice, and went still again. Ethan froze, waiting for the response he knew could come at any second. It didn't. The lioness took a half step back. Not far, not fast, just enough to clear the space between them. That was when Ethan understood this was not a rescue in the way the manuals described. There was no snatch, no last-second dash. What was happening now was deliberate, measured, shared, slow. Laura murmured from behind him. Ethan nodded once and lifted the cub. The weight surprised him, not heavy, but denser than it looked, as if life were clinging to every ounce. He rose in a single controlled motion and stepped backward toward the door. The lioness followed for 2 steps, then stopped. She did not cross the threshold. The door stood open now, light spilling onto the gravel, cutting a clean line between inside and out. Ethan crossed it with the cub pressed gently against his chest. Laura reached out, steadying his elbow as he passed, then guided him toward the table without a word. Mark closed the door. The sound was soft. Final. Dot. For a moment, no one moved. The room seemed to contract around the small white body now lying on the table. The hum of the lights, the distant wind, the muffled presence of something massive, just beyond the walls. Everything else receded. Laura leaned in first, placing 2 fingers against the cub's ribcage, counting under her breath. "Breathing's weak," she said quietly, "but it's still fighting." Ethan stepped back, hands empty now, feeling the absence immediately. He turned toward the glass. Outside, the lioness stood exactly where she had been when the door closed. Her silhouette filled the light, shoulders high, head lifted. She stared at the building, not pacing, not retreating, waiting. She did not strike the door. She did not call out. She held still. Laura began parting the cub's fur with practiced care. Under the white coat, the skin was reddened and swollen in places, marked by faint abrasions that didn't follow any natural pattern. Mark angled a flashlight closer, its beam cutting a narrow path through the fur. "There," Laura said. The thin line Ethan had glimpsed outside was unmistakable now. A translucent band, narrow as a finger, pressed deep into the cub's chest, disappearing beneath the forelimb and around the back. Plastic, got all. Industrial. Not something that belonged anywhere near a living animal. Mark let out a slow breath. "That's not from a snare," he said. "Too smooth." Laura nodded. "Packaging, tie. Or binding strap. It's been tightening every time the chest expands." Ethan's stomach dropped. He glanced back toward the yard. The lioness had lowered herself into a sit, forelegs straight, eyes never leaving the window. She could not see the table. She could not see the hands working over her cub. She could only wait. Laura reached for the cutting kit, then paused. "If I cut this wrong," she said, "it could rebound. Slice deeper. We need to stabilize first." Outside, a low sound rolled across the ground. Distant now, but closer than before. The ridge answered with another, overlapping call. Mark stiffened. "They're moving." Ethan looked from the cub to the lioness, then back again. The connection between those two spaces, inside and out, felt impossibly thin. A wall of glass and steel, separating a decision already made from its consequences. Laura wrapped the cub in a warming cloth, leaving the band exposed. "I'm going to take it slow," she said. "Very slow." Ethan rested his palm against the glass, not touching it hard enough to make a sound. The lioness shifted her weight, eyes flicking briefly toward the dark beyond the lights, then returning to the station. She did not come closer. She did not leave. She had delivered what she could no longer protect on her own. Whatever happened now was no longer hers to control. Inside, the first tool touched the plastic, and the room held its breath. Outside, the lioness waited in silence. Laura did not cut the plastic right away. She steadied the cub's chest with one hand, feeling the uneven rhythm beneath her fingers, and used the other to trace the band's path under the fur. The strip disappeared beneath the foreleg and re-emerged along the spine, embedded enough that the skin had begun to swell around it. "This has been here a while," she said quietly. "Long enough to change how it breathes." Mark leaned closer, angling the light. "That's not a snare," he said again, firmer now. "No knots. No wire. That's packaging strap." Ethan felt the word settle slowly, heavily. Packaging strap meant trucks, shipments, human hands. It meant something that had never been meant to hold a living thing, tightening each time the cub drew a breath, turning growth into pressure. Laura slid a thin stabilizer beneath the band to keep it from snapping inward when cut. "If this recoils," she said, "it'll dig deeper. I need to release tension in stages." Outside, another rumble carried in from the west, closer now, layered with movement. The sound rolled across the yard and into the building, low enough to be felt through the floor. "They're close," Mark said. "Closer than I like." Ethan glanced at the window. The lioness had risen from her sit. She stood facing the ridge, body angled, head lifted, ears rotating between the darkness and the station. Her stance had changed. No longer waiting. Preparing. "She's buying us time," Laura said without looking up. Ethan didn't answer. He watched the lioness's flank, the faint scars visible now that the light caught her at the right angle. Fresh abrasions. Thin smears of something translucent near her hind leg. Plastic. The realization hit him with a dull force. "She tried to get it off," he said. Laura's hands paused for a fraction of a second. "That would explain the placement," she said. "If she pulled with her teeth, it would tighten," Mark finished. The cub shuddered weakly as Laura began the first careful cut, easing just enough tension to let the chest expand more fully. The change was subtle but immediate. The next breath came deeper, longer, as if air had finally been allowed into a space that had been closing for days. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized had been holding. Laura worked in silence after that, releasing the band millimeter by millimeter. Each cut was followed by a pause, her fingers resting lightly against the cub's ribs, waiting for the body to catch up. The room felt suspended in those moments, as if sound itself were being rationed. Outside, the lioness paced once, then stopped. She glanced back at the building, eyes searching the glass for something she could not see. "She doesn't know if we can fix this," Mark said softly. "No," Ethan replied. "She just knows she can't." The final segment of the strap came free with a soft snap, recoiling harmlessly into Laura's hand. The cub drew a full breath. Still weak, still uneven, but unmistakably deeper than before. Its paws twitched, a faint sign of returning strength. Laura exhaled slowly. "It's not out of danger," she said, "but it has a chance now." Ethan turned toward the window. The lioness stood motionless, staring into the light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she lowered her head just slightly, and the tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. She did not approach. She did not call out. She simply stood there, as if acknowledging that whatever could be done here had been done. Mark's radio crackled suddenly. "I'm picking up vehicle tracks near the South Access Road," a voice reported. "Fresh. Within hours." Laura closed her eyes briefly. "That explains it." Ethan felt something hard settle in his chest. The cub hadn't wandered into danger. Danger had been dropped into its world. And when the lioness had reached the end of what teeth and strength could solve, she had followed the trail back to its source. To them. Outside, the lioness turned her head toward the ridge one last time. The distant shapes shifted, uneasy, but held their distance. She took a step into the darkness, then another, her body dissolving into shadow with the same quiet control she'd shown all night. She did not look back. Inside the station, the cub breathed on, fragile but alive, the plastic band lying coiled on the table like a piece of evidence no one wanted to claim. Ethan understood now why she had come. Not because she trusted them, but because she recognized responsibility when she saw it. The cub's breathing settled into a fragile rhythm, uneven but steady enough to count. Laura adjusted the warming wrap and checked the monitor again, her movements precise, economical. There was no relief in her posture, only focus. Experience had taught her that early improvements were promises, not guarantees. "It needs transport," she said quietly. "Soon, but not yet." Ethan nodded. He stepped away from the table and returned to the glass, drawn there by a pull he couldn't name. Outside, the yard was empty. The floodlights spilled onto gravel and scrub, illuminating nothing but tracks. Fresh, deep impressions where the lioness had stood for hours. "She's gone," Mark said, joining him. "For now," Ethan replied. Mark lifted the radio, listening. The males backed off when she did. "They're still out there, but the pressure's eased." Ethan's eyes followed the line of the fence into the dark beyond. He imagined the lioness moving through that space alone, her pace steady despite exhaustion, the risk recalculated now that her cub was no longer at her side. He wondered how far she would go before stopping, whether she would wait nearby or keep moving until dawn forced a decision. Behind him, the cub shifted and let out a faint sound, thin but present. Laura turned toward the noise immediately, checking reflexes, adjusting the wrap. "Response is improving," she said, "but it's going to crash if we don't keep heat and fluid steady." Mark glanced at the time. "Regional vet's 2 hours out. We hold until then," Laura said. "No shortcuts." Ethan stayed at the window a moment longer, then stepped outside. The night air felt heavier now, carrying the layered sense of dust, animal, and something sharp and synthetic. He crouched near the spot where the lioness had waited and found what he'd suspected. Flecks of translucent plastic clinging to the ground, a thin smear along a stone where something had been dragged and fought. She hadn't just carried the cub here. She had wrestled with the problem first. Ethan stood and keyed the radio. "Mark," he said, "log the site. We've got contamination. Industrial. Not old." Mark acknowledged without comment. When Ethan returned inside, Laura looked up at him. "You should know," she said. "If she comes back and the cub's not here, that could be a problem." Ethan understood. They had crossed a line together. If the lioness returned, expecting a continuation of that exchange, there would be nothing simple about the next encounter. A rumble rolled across the basin, distant but unmistakable. Mark stiffened. That's closer than before. Ethan went back to the glass just in time to see movement at the edge of the lights. Not a charge. Not a retreat. A pause. Then, the lioness stepped into view. She was alone. Her coat was darker now, dusted with shadow. She stopped at the same boundary she had respected all night and stood there, head high, eyes searching the building. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He opened the inner door a fraction, just enough to let her see him clearly. He raised one hand, not a signal, not a command, just presence. The lioness's gaze flicked past him, toward the interior. She could not see the table, the wraps, the careful hand. She could only read the absence, the space where the cub should have been. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she turned her head, scanning the darkness behind her, ears rotating as if reassessing a map she already knew too well. She took one step back, then another, stopping just short of the shadows. Ethan held his breath. The lioness looked at him once more. There was no accusation in her eyes. No gratitude. Only calculation. Whatever decision she made next would be hers alone. She turned and walked into the dark. No sound. No hesitation. Ethan closed the door gently and leaned his forehead against the glass for a brief, private second. Inside, the cub breathed on, fragile but present, tethered now to a future that depended entirely on human follow-through. Laura approached quietly. "She won't wait forever," she said. Ethan straightened. "Neither will we." As dawn began to thin the night, the station felt changed. Not louder, not busier, but heavier. They had intervened, and in doing so, accepted something they could not hand back. Outside, the tracks remained. Inside, the cub slept, bound not by plastic now, but by the fragile promise of what came next. Morning arrived without ceremony. The light crept in low and pale, thinning the shadows that had held the night together. Red Basin Wildlife Outpost looked unchanged from the outside. Same concrete, same fencing, same wind dragging dust across the yard. But Ethan felt the difference the moment he stepped back into the control room. The cub had made it through the night. Not strong, not safe, but alive in a way that had not been possible hours earlier. Its breathing was steadier now, still shallow, still guarded, but no longer fighting itself. Laura adjusted the wrap and checked the readouts again, her face composed in that familiar way that meant hope was present, but conditional. "The vet team's 10 minutes out," she said. "We did what we could here." Ethan nodded. He stood by the window, watching the daylight settle into the basin. Tracks were clearer now, paw prints overlapping. The lioness path etched deeply where she had paused and waited. Beyond them, the ground told another story. Tire impressions cutting across the scrub, crushed plastic half buried in sand. A place where something human had entered and left without noticing what it displaced. Mark came in from outside, pulling off his gloves. "South access is worse than we thought," he said. "Illegal dumping. Fresh. Whoever did it didn't bother to hide." Laura closed her eyes briefly. No one spoke. The answer had been there all along, written in the strap that had nearly killed the cub. This was not bad luck. It was spillover. The transport team arrived quietly, professionalism filling the space where urgency had lived all night. The cub was secured, monitored, prepared for the drive to a facility that could give it what Red Basin could not. Ethan watched as the small white body was lifted, cradled not by a mother's jaw now, but by careful hands trained to replace strength with precision. As the vehicle pulled away, dust rising behind it, the yard fell silent again. Ethan stepped outside alone. He walked to the edge of the lights and stopped where the lioness had stood. From here, the basin stretched open and exposed, daylight revealing how thin the boundary really was between refuge and risk. He imagined her out there now, moving, watching, adjusting to a world that had taken something from her and given nothing back in return. Or so it would seem. Later that afternoon, as reports were filed and calls were made, a notification chimed softly in the control room. One of the remote cameras, placed months earlier near the perimeter trail, had captured movement. Ethan pulled up the footage. Timestamp marked early morning, just after dawn. The image resolved slowly. Scrub, shadow, then a familiar shape stepping into frame. The Lioness paused, exactly where the light from the station would have ended hours before. She stood there for a long moment, body still, head lifted, testing the air. She did not search for the cub. She looked at the building, not the door, not the yard, the station itself. After a while, she turned away and walked back into the basin, her form dissolving into distance, until there was nothing left but wind and space. Ethan let the video run to the end, then sat back, the weight of it settling in his chest. She had not come for reassurance. She had not come for closure. She had come to see whether the place she had chosen had remained what it claimed to be. Outside, the basin went on, indifferent to explanation. Inside, the evidence of the night remained. A strip of plastic sealed in a bag, tracks logged and photographed, a report that would move slowly through channels not built for urgency. Ethan knew the cub might never return to the wild. He also knew that survival did not always look the way people wanted it to. Sometimes it looked like interruption. Sometimes it looked like responsibility that could not be set down again. The Lioness had not brought her cub to the station because she trusted human. She brought it because she recognized cause and effect. And she expected, without asking, that those who created the danger would not look away when it arrived at their door. As the sun climbed higher, Ethan stepped back inside and closed the door behind him. The station lights dimmed automatically, returning the basin to its natural balance of shadow and heat. Out there, life would continue to make its own calculation. In here, so would they. If this story made you stop and think, even for a moment, leave a "wano" in the comments. If you believe the Lioness did the only thing she could, leave a 0 total. No explanations needed. Just let us know you were here, and that the story reached you. If you want to keep watching real, thoughtful stories like this, stories about the quiet moments where animals and people cross paths, subscribe to the channel. We're sharing more of these true-to-life encounters, one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.